I would like to thank the committee for the 2019 Louis A. Coser Award for their work. And I would like to thank everyone who is taking an interest during this difficult historical moment that we find ourselves in. I begin by pointing out what would be obvious to you if we were all in the same room together, which is that while delivered by an individual, the Coser Lecture has traditionally been a communal event. It's an occasion where the community of sociologists who feel they have a stake in theory, who feel they have a stake in sociology as a whole, come together. They come together to see each other, but also to disagree with each other via the words of the speaker. So I'd like to invite you to imagine this community. Imagine who would be there. Imagine who you would like to be there. And perhaps you can return to this image of this community on a few occasions in the year going forward until we meet again. In my talk, I'd like to pursue also a more specific intellectual goal, which is to assert the role of a sociology of the social sciences among meta-conversations in the social sciences. I'm thinking specifically about a sociology informed by the sociology of practice and informed by empirical research on the natural sciences in the social studies of science. I'm arguing for a specific kind of reflexivity, a reflexivity that can stand beside the individual reflection that we practice in our conversations about methodology, and a specific kind of reflexivity that can take its place alongside the more abstracted reflexivity that is practiced in the philosophy of the social sciences and in the analysis and critique of epistemological orientations. You can see here the structure of my talk. I would like to situate my argument and then provide some example which I hope show how the kind of reflexivity I'm advocating can be useful for our research. I want to share some observations about how we practice comparison and share some observations about how we select cases. I draw on the German sociologist André Kieseling to ask about reflexivity as self-observation or self-description. Every field of practice can be examined with a view to what forms and what content it gives to its self-observation. I want to ask, how does sociology, how do the social sciences observe and describe themselves? What are the different ways in which they do so? How are they distributed? And how does this distribution compare to the space of possible ways of observing themselves? I would submit that sociology observes itself in a range of ways that fill out the space of possible ways of observing itself in an uneven manner. That means you have some concentration in some areas, which entails some duplication, and some spaces that are left empty or at least underused, underutilized. I think there are two predominant ways for sociology to observe itself. One is the mode of methodology. Here we discuss a range of questions about how we conduct research, how do we select cases, how do we deal with missing data, how do we use interview questions to elicit tacit knowledge as well as explicit value commitments, and so on and so on. Within that grouping of self-observation, I would also locate the official definition, if you will, of reflexivity as the examination by a researcher of their feelings, value commitments, and their social position. The other predominant way of self-observation has been heavily influenced by philosophical approaches. Reflection has often focused on the epistemological orientation of different kinds of research. So scholars debate the virtues or faults of realism, naturalism, interpretivism, for example. These labels are sometimes used in a gesture of self-identification, such as empirical analytical sociology, and sometimes are used in ascriptions that we impose on others who are not currently speaking, such as positivism. We find these types of self-observations both in scholarly contribution, publications, but also in more everyday speech acts that involve the construction and evocation of opposing camps. I'd like to point out that in all these cases, these labels are the result of a process of distillation or abstraction of a position that is inevitably at some considerable distance from the actual research practice and also from the concrete claims and findings that we might produce, share, and debate. This kind of reflection involves the construction of wholes that I would like us to find somewhat curious, that usually carry normative baggage, with the whole either being negative, them, what we critique, or positive, us, the program, which we subscribe to. Traditionally or historically, a range of authors and a range of projects have used this type of abstracted reflection on what they then call the scientific method in the philosophy of science, to dismiss a range of other traditions as being outside of the scientific method as identified by these scholars. But I would like to point out that in this practice of distillation, this distillation from actual research practices, the staunchest critics of the scientific methods, of objectivity or of Western science often concur with its most militant defenders. If we take the claims that are made about sociology in the construction of these camps seriously as sociological claims, as claims that are part of the sociology of the social sciences, which would have to be part of the sociology of culture, these claims would rest on a particular understanding of culture. It would be an understanding of culture that focused heavily on content, explicit or ascribed, and on commitments, what used to be called values. This content or these values are then often related to some higher good, science, or some higher bad, oppression. This understanding of culture is a macro-cultural understanding, which also underlies the more critical notions of ideology or discourse. It would be an understanding of culture that I see a lot of colleagues in the sociology of culture actively trying to move away from, and that I think should at least be contextualized within accounts of other factors that shape the knowledge that we produce. In a departure from this circular opposition between ideology and the critique of ideology, I, along with others, see an opportunity to renew the reflection on the social sciences based on sociological observations of the social sciences. Observations that we would judge by similar standards which we would use to judge studies of the art world, of humanitarianism, or of religion. In these fields, we've largely moved away from an analysis that is based primarily on the remote analysis of ideological content. There has long been a tradition in the sociology of sociology, and also a history of serious calls to do the history of sociology more seriously in a historical way. And this work has received important impulses in recent decades from work in the empirical studies of the natural sciences, which now has turned its attention to the social sciences as well. There's a lot of work that we can build on. I just want to highlight 3 sets of conversations that I have learned from personally. On the one hand, there are initiatives in the UK, among them the initiative to investigate the social life of methods, led at some point by Evelyn Rupert, John Law and Mike Savage. There's also the volume by Charles Kamek, Neil Gross and Michel Lamont that you might be familiar with, entitled Social Knowledge in the Making. And lastly, I've been a member of a network in Germany on the sociology of sociology, organized by Franz Retzky, Martina Franzen and others, which also has had a series of distinguished visitors and guests. When we seek to complement the philosophy of the social sciences with the sociology of the social sciences, we want to remember that our own colleagues in the sociology of science and the social studies of science more broadly have fought quite successfully to displace philosophy, to displace a sort of desk-based reconstruction of what good knowledge looks like or should look like in the abstract with a sociological orientation towards what research actually looks like. There's one important insight in this empirical research on the natural sciences that I would like to emphasize here, which is the insight into the disunity of science. We can note that until quite recently, the self-reflection of the social sciences in the philosophy of the social sciences, but also in broader conversations labeled as theory, has been dominated by a debate about whether or not the social sciences are like the natural sciences. This idea of the natural sciences in the singular has been important for the Methodenstreit in the 19th century, has shaped both Weber and Durkheim, though at that time the idea of the natural sciences, we can note, has been shaped and mediated by their perception of what the economists were doing. This debate is carried forward in debates about positivism in the 1960s and 70s and are still being carried forward in labels like scientific, empirical, positivist, quantitative, and interpretivist, qualitative, and critical. These are not old conflicts. We have survey data taken among American sociologists that attests to the persistence of the divisions construed in these terms. And in Germany, we have since 2017 2 associations which claim to represent the discipline, with the more recently founded one emphasizing the scientific nature of the work of their members. This idea of the natural sciences has not been informed by empirical research on the natural sciences, as Karin Knorr-Tizina has noted already in an article in 1981, with direct reference both to her own path-breaking research on research in the natural sciences and with reference to the self-reflection of the social sciences quite directly. Ethnographic and historical studies paying attention to the practice and material culture of science have shown how science is produced in particular locations with particular practices and tools, and how this shapes the content and the results of scientific work. The precise legacy of these studies is and remains contested. Though constructivist in a broad sense, these accounts were never relativist in the way it's been construed by some opponents. Research in this tradition has consistently shown how much systematic work, how much effort, skill, and reflection goes into producing what counts as scientific results. What we sometimes see is that findings are contingent, contextual, historical, and temporary, but they're not arbitrary. I think that's an important point, that the findings are contingent does not mean that they are arbitrary. While some have chosen to be provoked by these studies in the name of science, hence the science wars, the challenge of these findings has not been so much to the sciences, but rather to the philosophy of science, and more particular to a specific philosophy of science which produced an account of scientific activity that was based on an idealized representation of theoretical physics. What these studies do show is that research within the natural sciences operates according to quite diverse logics, with different setups that are each elaborate and complex. Scientists collect data in the field, they study historical processes, they work with different kinds of abstracted traces as well as images on computers, and they work within laboratories that are themselves quite diverse in their setup. If we take these findings seriously, and they are empirical findings, what are we to make of calls for sociological unity in the name of science? Jonathan Turner, for example, called in his presidential address to the Pacific Sociological Association in 1988 on sociologists to, I quote, commit to science rather than ideology, smugness, and tolerance of any thought. And he advocated for, a quote, a mature and well-integrated science of society on these terms. In light of the findings on the diversity of scientific practices, I would suggest this gesture bears some similarity to populism. If populism is a gesturing towards the people in a way that suggests a unified object and legitimizes the speaker, while leaving the benefits to those invoked unclear and unanalyzed, there's also a populism of science, which we can see when the ideal of science, with its connotation of reason and progress, gets entangled in an exercise of flag waving with a very loose link between the flag and the range of projects it draws in to celebrate. These projects may all be individually excellent, such as in the projects brought together under empirical analytical sociology, but their excellence is diverse and can't be labeled very easily in a way to exclude others which are rooted in having an accountable process of their own kind in terms of how claims are produced and how findings are produced. The different kinds of projects that we might call quantitative research are not in any straightforward way like scientific research. They are not very much like each other, either in a good way or in a bad way. This is why I would not really call what are sometimes called epistemological conflicts. These are epistemicized conflicts, meaning they are always also about something else. In calling for more sociology in the way sociologists exercise reflexivity, I need to pay homage to Pierre Bourdieu, who coined the term participant objectification for this in a lecture at the British Royal Anthropological Institute, which by chance I saw him deliver when I was a student in London in the year 2000. To me, the key quote in this lecture is the following. In this quote, Bourdieu distinguishes individual reflexivity from a reflexivity informed by the sociology of sociology, though he uses the terms narcissistic on the one hand and scientific on the other hand to make that distinction, which would not be the terms I would use. Bourdieu and others using his concept have made important contributions with sociological research on sociology and related fields. Attention to particular dynamics of fields helps to avoid two tendencies in cultural analysis, which Bourdieu has described as, on the one hand, I quote, an internal reading of the text, which consists in considering the text in itself and for itself, and, on the other hand, an external reading which crudely relates the text to society in general. I would like to highlight research on internationalization and its unequal effects by Marion Foucault, Fernanda Bechel, Johann Heilbronn and others, and research on sociology's imperialist past by George Steinmetz. The way the scholastic disposition shapes sociological research and the analysis of field dynamics can actually help explain why conflicts in the fields take this epistemicized form that I have described. But I think we can get closer to the content of knowledge practices. We can get closer to the specific practices researchers use, and we can get closer to the specific claims researchers make about particular objects of epistemic interest in particular papers. I am inspired by the ethnographic work in science and technology studies, which has done a lot to further bridge that gap between sociological accounts that tend to focus on knowledge production from the outside and the works that take the content of the work really seriously. I'm also inspired by the attention to tools, sites, materiality in that tradition. I think we can also ask questions about the patterns in our collective output, and that's perhaps more in the tradition of a sociology of science rather than STS in its classic forms. We can draw on Merton to frame our inquiries as inquiries into the cognitive and social patterns of scientific practices. I've had some good discussions with a very thoughtful historian of science who was wondering if we can really produce an account of sociology, for example, as a specific form of knowledge from within the discipline. She thought historians are better equipped to do this, outsiders are better equipped to do this. I think that we are quite used to wearing different hats at different times and doing our best, both as people and as sociologists. I think when we ask about patterns in the production of social knowledge, we can compare these patterns to our assumption and expectations. We can compare them to the space of possibles for these practices. So we can compare the research that is to the research that could be. And we can perhaps make some observations that might be useful for further research, such as, for example, we might identify some paths that are less traveled within this space of possibles, but that might be useful to explore more and to do more of in the context of the goals of research in a discipline or a field of research. We can, for example, ask how we as a discipline practice comparison. This is an example where I would say reflexivity, the self-observation of the field, has been limited by what I have called epistemicization. Until quite recently, we've had quite a polarized conversation where some scholars are policing a very narrow definition of comparison in the name of science and progress and reason, and others reject comparison as a research strategy almost entirely in the name of the unique sometimes, or in the name of resistance against dominant epistemologies, or against power relationships more generally. George Steinmetz has analyzed the long history of this latter tradition, of this resistance to comparison, in an important article. I suggest that if we take a closer look at the practices associated with traditional comparison in the social sciences, we find that they are not held together by an ideology. They're not held together by researchers' commitment to abstract ideas about science or about positivism. Rather, I think we can trace the particular techniques that researchers use to particular research problems in particular corners of the natural and life sciences. Among these particular research problems and practices in the life sciences, I would highlight the clinical trial, which has had an important influence on social scientific research and social scientists' conceptions of what natural science research is like. As researchers emulate the clinical trial, they have imported a set of assumptions which then have become important also in other areas of research. Among these assumptions is first that explanation, rather than description, say, is the main aim of our research. It's also a particular explanation that it is assumed we should seek, an explanation that is associated with the assumptions that Andrew Abbott analyzes as general linear reality. You have a clear separation between cause and effect. You're thinking about cause as something that is established in a competition among candidates, sort of like in a horse race. And while there's a seriality to the practice of comparison, it's always the same comparison that is repeated time after time after time, on the assumption that the comparison can only handle one difference at any one time. Some practitioners associate these assumptions with the scientific method, but that's a practice of abstraction, an abstraction that critics have sometimes participated in when they have painted a very homogeneous picture of traditional practices in the social sciences and summed this up under these epistemological ascriptions. As a result, as scholars in the humanities, in anthropology and sociology began to rediscover comparison and different forms of comparison, they have sometimes been led to a rhetoric of resistance and transgression and innovation that perhaps was also a burden that wasn't always realistic or helpful. In reality, the practices of comparison have always been more diverse in the natural sciences and in the social sciences and humanities. We're at the moment very interested in clinical trials in the context of COVID-19, but the comparison that vaccine researchers use in their trials are very different in aim and procedure from the comparisons that, say, the modelers in epidemiology use. Those comparisons are again different from the comparisons that virologists use when they try to understand the nature and the course and the properties of SARS-2 in the context of SARS-1, MERS, the influenza viruses, herpes, HIV, and the mosquito-borne chikungunya virus. If we acknowledge the broader set of aims that comparisons can be useful for, including explanation, but also a range of different kinds of explanation, including description, including critique, we can identify some forms of comparisons that are useful but are not as widely used in the social sciences as they could be. I discussed this a bit more in another paper, but here I thought I might highlight one particular example, the asymmetric comparison. It seems to me to have rather limited current practices of comparison, that we assume that all compared cases need to be given equal amounts of attention. In writing and assessing explicitly comparative research, we spend a lot of time thinking about which case or cases should be considered. Most qualitative designs still consider only one case, and both single case and explicitly comparative studies spend too little time thinking about other relevant cases and literatures, or about the larger diversity in the world, which could be considered by drawing from information that is widely available or in research that is perhaps less in-depth. There are reasons to be skeptical of asymmetric comparison, that is, comparisons where we don't spend equal amounts of time and attention on all the cases considered. But we should examine carefully how and whether these reservations are relevant for any given research project. First, if the concern is for the comparison to be a staging ground for a fair competition among causes, as in the clinical trial, then it doesn't make sense to treat all competitors in the same way. But this is not relevant for all kinds of explanatory projects, and it's not relevant for comparisons that aim at conceptualization. Second, the preference for symmetrical comparison makes sense in terms of certain assumptions about measurement or descriptions. Symmetry of attention appears as the default if measurement is taken to have no costs because one is working with a data set that is already existing. Second, if measurement is unproblematically assumed to be either true or false, it's of course important to exclude data that is very poor. But most social science research encounters more complex trade-offs between different aims of the research, among them quality of information, but there are other strategic aims. Though we tend not to make them explicit, a lot of different kinds of comparison go into conceptualization and description, and most of them are asymmetrical. Of course, good empirical research has to contribute new in-depth knowledge on some case or cases, but such research can be enriched by considering other relevant objects that are different from the target object on a range of dimensions, by drawing on information from the secondary literature, even from fiction or from pure thinking exercises. I have suggested that the self-observation of the social sciences concerning comparative research has been heavily focused on epistemological orientation. I have suggested that we might usefully focus on the practices of comparison instead. We have some very good ethnographic studies of how comparisons are used in individual research projects. I think it's also useful to look at how comparisons are practiced across studies and to look at this in the context of the space of possibles of how comparisons could be used. I want to give you another example of the kind of conversations we might have based on the kind of self-observation I'm advocating for. I've been interested for some time now in the way biologists use model systems like the fruit fly, which you see on this image. I've been interested in comparing what biologists do when they use model systems to practices in the social sciences, and I've originally explored this in an article with Michael Guggenheim. Biologists select particular organisms for study, which they use in order to answer questions about life and death, development and disease. Some organisms are more frequently used than others and have become model organisms, attracting disproportionate amounts of attention and resources and shaping whole fields of research. The fruit fly, which you see here, is perhaps the most famous of these, but we can also think of the mouse, the rat, certain kinds of dogs, as well as particular kind of viruses, bacteria, and sometimes whole ecosystems, which are mostly islands. Based on research in the sociology and philosophy of science, on biological research, and on research in interdisciplinary contexts, I would distinguish between material research objects and epistemic research objects. Material research objects are concrete objects which are chosen in order to understand something else, the epistemic research object or epistemic target. So the fruit fly is chosen in order to understand processes in genetics or in neurology. We can then ask, how are material research objects chosen? This is different from asking how they should be chosen, which is the subject of a very strong methodological and theoretical literature on case selection in sociology. What I want to do here is to take a detour to ask first about empirical patterns. And I note that this is a detour that we often ask of our students and of professionals in other fields. So they are rightly concerned with normative and practical questions, but we ask for their patience and invite them to take an interest into our inquiries into patterns in the world, which can then inform perhaps the answers to the questions about what is to be done. We can note that sociologists do not choose material research objects or cases for purely strategic reasons. Neither, by the way, do biologists. Well, the factor that perhaps most obviously shapes how we select research objects is convenience, which can mean many different things, ranging from the most intrinsic to the most instrumental. It can be very convenient if the military sponsors my study, for example. But I want to highlight what the term uniquely draws attention to, the mundane logistical aspects of convenience. Research sites and objects in a range of substantive areas are sponsored by the fact that they are situated in an area where universities and researchers concentrate. As Marie-Louise Small, whose discussion of the role of Chicago in urban sociology has been very important for me in thinking about this, has observed PhD students who don't do what relative to the location of the university is called research abroad or international fieldwork, rarely do qualitative studies in an area that is very far from their university unless they have a partner or family in some other city or location. Historicism has been an important factor in sponsoring some cases. There seems to be a strong bias, certainly in sociology and political science, in favor of material research objects, which can be framed as the most advanced within their category. Thinkers with post-colonial thought have identified one very consequential version of this, which I would call macro-historicism, the privileging of some countries or regions of the world as the most advanced countries. The notions of modernity and development have posited a movement in history and situated cases within that history, even though they coexist in the present. That has been used to justify a focus on some countries rather than others, and to imply that lessons from these countries can be transferred to other cases, even if it may take some time. This has severely limited attention to the global south, and it has limited the range of issues that cases from the global south have been made to speak to. There is another version of this focus on what are supposedly the most advanced cases, which I would call microhistoricism, by which I mean a focus on the most advanced cases, in quotation marks, within a range of more specific subfields. There's a focus on growing cities in urban sociology on the assumption that to study growing cities is to study the future, is to study what other cities will become. Similarly, to study work has often been to study the most advanced forms of work, and relatedly, to study organizations has been to study the most advanced forms of organizations. This developmentalist orientation is often normatively charged. As such, depending almost on the temperament of the authors involved, it can take a utopian or a dystopian bent. The most advanced forms of work might be studied in order to examine the forms of contradiction or resistance which they might generate. In a different version of critical work, the most advanced forms of governmentality might be studied in order to understand the future of a society of control. Cognitive sociologists have shown that categories are understood in schematic ways in the general population. This suggests that, to the extent that social scientific categories are also popular categories, popular schemas might influence case selection also among academics. It has been shown, for example, that US-based multinational firms who own strong brands are heavily overrepresented in international management research. This bias in research studies might coincide with the cognitive bias in the general population vis-à-vis the category corporation. In one of my own fields of research, the study of humanitarian relief, scholars have focused heavily on NGOs, as opposed to states in affected regions, say, or even the UN, and among NGOs, they have in particular focused on one NGO, Doctors Without Borders. This has a number of reasons, including some good scholarly reasons in each of these studies on Doctors Without Borders, but it is overall somewhat disproportionate, and it does coincide with a very high level of recognition of that organization among international charities in the general public. We can also explore hypotheses about schemas that researchers might carry not because they're members of the general population, but because of something that they share as a community of researchers. Until recently, perhaps an obvious example, scholars of social movements have tended to overstudy movements that they like, and there have been comparatively fewer studies of the extreme right and of racist mobilizations. Academics' experience of inside their own workplaces has spurred interest in managerialism, and the university has featured prominently in discussions of audit culture, rankings, and neoliberalism. Of course, if we explore hypotheses about the impact of scholarly subcultures, we can also explore variation within and across scholarly communities in different disciplines, different social groups, and different parts of the world. The factors that sponsor some research objects over others shape the knowledge we produce. This is sometimes reflected in specific research fields, but is rarely reflected across research fields. I'd be interested to hear your observations for what you think are the overstudied places and sites and cases in your fields of research and in relation to the categories of epistemic objects that you're interested in. If this was a live Zoom, I would be able to say, please put your observations into the chat. And I think that would be an interesting exercise. Now, what happens in some fields and some scholarly conversation is that you don't just have some cases that receive more attention than others, but that there are norms that develop that suggest that we should be studying the cases and places that have received a lot of attention. What happens when such norms arise is not that there is no research on other cases, but there is a dynamic whereby it is assumed that the general knowledge is more likely to be derived from cases that are receiving a lot of attention and are the central cases. Researchers in biology and related life sciences are sometimes explicitly encouraged to focus their attention in that way and to use overstudied objects to produce higher levels of insights on a collective level. And I would argue that we in the social sciences could also exploit the concentration of attention better and mitigate the disadvantages of the mitigation of attention better if we also reflected more explicitly on these conventions around what are privileged material research objects. I'm coming to the end of my talk. I have asked how sociology as a field observes itself, and I've suggested that the self-observation of the field has been heavily shaped by philosophical approaches and has focused on the analysis of epistemological orientations, which are analyzed at some remove from any actual research practices or specific claims that are made by specific papers. I've suggested that if we took the claims that are made in this discussion seriously as part of a sociology of culture, it would be a specific understanding of culture that is invoked, one that consists in either projecting a unified ideology or critiquing an ideology that is construed as a whole of some kind. I see no reason to believe that there is a Platonic ideal of science somewhere up there in the sky, and there doesn't seem to be one among the scientists over there, physicists, biologists, medical researchers, and so on. Rather, there is a range of accountable practices of knowledge production that are systematic, each in their own way. I suggest we could learn from taking these practices more seriously also amongst each other. So I suggest that we might pause when we note ourselves doing this distilling from practice into abstraction and perhaps abstain from doing it. I've discussed a few of the observations we can make when we look at sociology and to some extent the social sciences more broadly, not through these epistemicized oppositions, but around them. I've had discussions with colleagues about whether an observation of sociology that is disciplined in a sociological way is compatible with the desire to improve sociological research, and I think it absolutely is. I think the discussion of empirical patterns in how researchers actually select cases, for example, raises important questions about collective methodology in addition to individual methodology, and I think we could spend more time discussing collective aspects of our method. When I'm talking about collective methods, I'm not thinking about individual or school-based attempts to legislate the terms we use or to standardize the meanings of key concepts. As a sociologist, I have to be skeptical of those. I'm thinking of more piecemeal efforts to help improve the way we link the findings of different studies, to help us avoid duplication, efforts to help us avoid geographical provincialism, period-based provincialism, and school-based provincialism, and to help us do the best research we can do as a group and across studies as well as individually.